I still remember the way the tape hissed in those first 3 seconds before his voice came through. That low hum that meant something was about to be said that mattered. Johnny Cash stood in the booth with his eyes closed, and I was 22 years old, holding a clipboard I didn't need, watching a man try to sing his way out of temptation. But here's what nobody talks about when they tell the story of that song. Here's what got buried under all the mythology about Johnny and Vivian and the long lonely highways. That song didn't just keep one man faithful. It saved a marriage that had nothing to do with Johnny Cash at all. And for 69 years, only 3 of us knew it happened. I was a session assistant at Sun Studio in Memphis, which is a fancy way of saying I rolled cables and fetched coffee and tried not to get in the way of men who knew what they were doing. My job was to be invisible. I was good at it. I watched people when they thought no one was looking. I noticed things. And that winter, in early '56, I noticed that our lead engineer, a man I'll call Martin, because his daughter still lives in Nashville and doesn't need this attached to her father's name, was coming a party. He wore the same shirt 2 days in a row. He had scratches on his neck that didn't come from shaving. He startled when his wife called the studio line. And he spent every break in the alley with a woman who was not his wife, a backup singer with red lipstick, and a voice that could crack a heart at 30 paces. I knew what I was watching. Martin had 2 little girls at home, 3 and 5 years old. I'd seen the pictures on his workbench. One of them had his exact nose. His wife had just sent him a care package with homemade cornbread wrapped in wax paper because he'd been working double shifts to save for a better house. And here he was, leaning into this other woman in the alley, his hand on the small of her back, laughing in a way I'd never heard him laugh inside the studio. It made me sick. It made me angry. But I was 22, and nobody'd asked my opinion about how grown men should live, so I kept my mouth shut and rolled my cables and waited. That's when Johnny came in with the melody. He'd been on tour, and you could see it in his shoulders, the weight of all those miles and all those nights in rooms that weren't his own. He told Sam Phillips he'd written something for Vivian, something to remind himself why he got back on the bus every morning, instead of staying in whatever town had pretty girls and cold beer. Sam nodded and set up the session, and called Martin in to run the board. And I watched Martin walk in from that alley with his shirt buttoned wrong, smelling like someone else's perfume, and sit down at the console to record a song about Fidelity. I'm 69 years old now. I'm standing in what used to be the alley behind Sun Studio, which is a parking lot now, clean and paved, and tourists take pictures here without knowing what happened in this exact spot. Martin died in 2018. His wife outlived him by 3 years. They were married 57 years total. And last month his daughter called me because she'd found a box of her father's things, and inside it was a reel-to-reel tape, labeled Walk. Line rough take, January '56, and a note in his handwriting that said the day I walked back. She wanted to know what it meant. So I'm telling this now because she deserves to know her father wasn't perfect, but he made the right choice. And because that song did something Johnny never intended. Here's how it went down. Johnny stepped up to the mic and did a warm-up take. Just him and the guitar, that boom-chicka-boom rhythm he'd figured out by threading a piece of paper through his strings to get that snare drum snap. The melody was simple, repetitive, hypnotic. He sang about keeping watch on his heart, keeping his eyes open, keeping the ends out for the tie that binds. His voice sounded like gravel and honey. And Martin, sitting at the console with his hands on the faders, went completely still. I was standing in the corner with the cable rack. Sam was in the booth with Johnny, adjusting the mic placement. Martin was alone at the board. And I watched his face change. First confusion, like he was trying to remember something. Then recognition. Then something that looked like pain. He reached up and touched his wedding ring. He hadn't been wearing it the day before. I'd noticed because I noticed things. But now it was back on his finger, and he was turning it slowly, around and around, while Johnny sang about finding it easy to be true, and admitting he was a fool for love. The first take finished. Sam asked for another. Johnny nodded and started again. Same words, same melody. But this time Martin leaned forward and closed his eyes, and I saw his shoulders start to shake. Not much, just enough that I knew. He was crying, silently, the kind of crying men do when they're trying not to let anyone know they're breaking. Sam called for a third take, then a fourth. Each time Johnny sang those lines, I keep a close watch on this heart of mine. I keep my eyes wide open all the time. Martin got quieter and smaller, and more present all at once, if that makes sense. Like the song was burning something out of him. By the sixth take, his hands were steady on the board. By the eighth, he was nodding slightly, in time with the rhythm. And when Sam finally called it and said they had it, that this was the one, Martin stood up and walked out of the studio without a word. I followed him. I shouldn't have. It wasn't my business. But I was 22 and angry, and I'd been watching this man destroy something good, and I wanted to see what happened next. He went to the alley. The woman was there, waiting, smoking a cigarette in the cold. I stood inside the doorway where they couldn't see me, and I heard Martin say, "I can't do this anymore." Just like that. Flatten. Final. The woman laughed, thought he was joking. He said it again. "I can't do this. I'm going home." She got angry then. Asked him what changed. Asked him if he was really going to choose some boring life over what they had. And Martin, this man who'd been sneaking around for weeks, who'd been lying to everyone including himself, said something I've never forgotten. He said, "I just spent 2 hours watching a man sing about the cost of staying true, and I realized I can't pay the cost of walking away. I've got 2 little girls who have my nose, and a wife who sends me cornbread, and if I do this, if I keep doing this, I'm going to lose the only thing that matters. And for what? For this? I'm done." He walked past her, walked past me, got in his car, and drove home. I later learned he showed up at his house at 4 in the afternoon, which he never did, and told his wife everything. Asked her to forgive him. Told her it hadn't gone far, but it had gone far enough that he'd almost lost himself. And somehow, for reasons I'll never understand because grace is mysterious and marriage is complicated, she forgave him. They went to counseling. He quit working nights. Names. He never spoke to that woman again. Now, everyone knows the story of "I Walk the Line" as Johnny's promise to Vivian. It's in every biography, every documentary. The song kept him faithful during those early hellfire years of touring, when temptation was a daily fact and loneliness was worse. That's the official record, and it's true. Johnny said it himself in interviews. He wrote it in hotel rooms and backstage and on buses, a constant reminder to himself. The song became a hit, went to #1 on the country charts, crossed over to pop. It made Johnny Cash a star, and it kept his marriage intact, at least for a while, before other pressures pulled it apart years later. But here's what's not in the documentaries. Here's the thing that only happened because I was invisible and watching. And Martin trusted me years later when we worked together again, and he told me the whole story over whiskey one night in '73. True, that song created a ripple. It wasn't just Johnny's conscience it woke up. It was Martin's, and maybe others I didn't know about. Because when you sing about the cost of loyalty and the effort it takes to stay true, when you name it out loud and put it in a melody that gets inside someone's chest and lives there, you're not just changing your own behavior. You're holding up a mirror, and some people look in that mirror and see who they're becoming, and they don't like it, and they choose differently. Martin told me that every time he was tempted after that day, every time the road got hard or marriage felt boring or some new woman smiled at him in a way that promised easy comfort, he'd hear that opening line in his head. I keep a close watch on this heart of mine. He said it became his own reminder, not because he was trying to be Johnny Cash, but because the song named a thing he'd been too scared to name himself. That staying faithful wasn't passive. It was active. It was work. It was a choice you made 100 times a day. And the song made that choice feel possible. Feel worth it. The secret hidden for 69 years isn't about Johnny at all. It's about the man at the console. The man nobody remembers. The man who heard those words at the exact moment he needed to hear them and let them pull him back from the edge. Johnny walked the line for Vivian. But Martin walked the line because Johnny sang about it. And that might be the song's real power. Not just what it did for the man who wrote it, but what it did for everyone else who heard it and recognized themselves in the struggle. I think about that a lot now. How art works. How a song can say something true, and that truth doesn't just stay with the artist. It moves. It finds people. And sometimes it finds them at the exact right moment, when they're standing in an alley, or sitting at a console, or driving home alone, and it gives them the language for the choice they need to make. Johnny intended to write a song for his wife. He succeeded, but he also accidentally wrote a song for a session engineer in Memphis, who needed to hear that fidelity was something you fought for, not something you either had or didn't. And maybe that's why the song has lasted. Because it's not really about Johnny Cash's marriage. It's about everyone's marriage. Everyone's choice. Everyone's line. When Martin's daughter called me last month and asked what her father's note meant, I told her this story. I told her that her father almost made a terrible mistake and the song stopped him. That he walked back. That he chose her mother and chose her and her sister, and chose the life he'd built instead of the easy comfort of something new. She cried. Then she laughed. Then she said, "That sounds like Dad. He always said music saved him, but he never said how." So here's what I want you to understand. I Walk the Line is famous because Johnny Cash sang it, and because it's a perfect song with a perfect melody and perfect words. But its real legacy might not be what it did for Johnny. It might be what it did for Martin, and for however many other people, over 70 years now, have heard those words and recognized their own struggle and made the choice to stay, to keep watch, to keep their eyes open, to keep the ends out for the tie that binds. The song didn't just document Johnny's loyalty. It created loyalty in others. That's the secret. That's what's been hidden. Not because anyone covered it up, but because Martin never told anyone except me, and I never told anyone because it wasn't my story to tell. But now he's gone, and his wife is gone, and his daughter wants to know why her father kept that tape and wrote that note. And I think the answer is simple. He kept it to remind himself. On the hard days. On the days when walking the line felt impossible. He kept it so he could go back to that moment in the studio and remember that he'd made a choice, and it was the right choice, and the song had helped him make it. I still hear I Walk the Line sometimes, in grocery stores and diners, and on oldie stations that play it between commercials for reverse mortgages. And every time I think about Martin at the console with his hands shaking and his wedding ring back on his finger, listening to Johnny sing about vigilance and devotion, and deciding in real time that he was going to be the kind of man who kept his promises. The song didn't just walk Johnny home to Vivian, it walked Martin home to his wife and daughters. And when you listen to it now, when you hear that boom chicka boom rhythm and that gravel honey voice singing about keeping watch, you're hearing the song that saved 2 marriages. One famous, one invisible. Both real. Maybe the real question isn't whether Johnny Cash walked the line. History answered that day. He tried. He struggled in it. He mostly succeeded until other factors made it impossible. The real question is how many other people walked the line because he sang about it. How many people heard that song at the right moment and let it pull them back? How many marriages exist today because 70 years ago a young man in Memphis wrote down his own struggle and turned it into a melody and accidentally gave everyone else the language for their own fight? I think that number is higher than anyone knows. I think Martin wasn't the only one. I think that song has been quietly saving people for 7 decades, and nobody's ever added it up, because those stories are private and small, and they don't make it into the documentaries. But they're real, and they matter. And that's the secret that's been hidden for 69 years. Not that Johnny Cash struggled with Fidelity. Everyone knows that. But that his struggle turned into song gave other people the tools to win their own battles. That's the side effect nobody talks about. That's what I saw happen in real time in a studio in Memphis to a man whose name you don't know, but whose daughters grew up with a father who stayed. So here's what I'd ask you if you've made it this far with me. Think about a time when a song stopped you from making a mistake. When you heard something at exactly the right moment and it gave you the language or the courage or the clarity to choose differently. Drop that memory in the comments. Tell me the song and the moment. Because I think those stories matter. I think they're the real legacy of what music does. Not just what it means to the person who writes it, but what it means to everyone else who hears it, and finds themselves inside it, and lets it change the course of their lives. That's what Johnny Cash gave us with I Walk the Line. Not just his promise, but permission to make our own.